Atsushi Nakajima is an 18-year-old orphan who gets thrown out of his orphanage for being a useless wimp. After he saves a delusional man addicted to unaliving himself, Atsushi finds out that he is a dollar store beast boy who now has to join a squad of nutjobs playing pretend Justice League. Atsushi, whose belly worms were feasting on his intestines, was beside the river hallucinating about Chazuke. After remembering how the caretakers at his orphanage asked him to do humanity a favor by unaliving himself, he decided to take matters into his own hands and try robbing someone. But with the only people around being a biker and the police force, he quickly changed his mind and resorted to the only option available, which was a pair of legs floating down the river. After a lot of internal negotiation, he rescued the floater, who didn't seem happy with being rescued. As a matter of fact, he was pissed off with the starving orphan for interrupting his attempt to meet his maker. But since he had disturbed a random person with his plans, the bandaged psycho decided to treat the orphan to a bowl of chazuke. When the psycho's work pal, a weirdo in a ponytail named Kunikida, who gets his fashion advice from a toddler, showed up, Dazai Osamu, the creep with an addiction to unaliving himself, decided that Kunikida would be their credit card for the day. After stuffing his face while Kunikida scolded Dazai for making him mess up his schedule, Atsushi asked them about their jobs, and Kunikida explained that they were part of the Armed Detective Agency, an organization of supernatural detectives who handled cases involving supernatural activities beyond the ability of regular law enforcement agencies. When they told him that they were actually in town trying to find a man-eating tiger terrorizing the locals, he tried to run away, and after failing spectacularly, he told them that the same tiger had destroyed the crops and food at his orphanage, which was what made them kick him out, as food was scarce. He had since been seeing the tiger at multiple instances and felt that it was following him. The bandaged psychopath then sent Kunikida off with a message for their president and convinced the broke orphan to act as bait for the tiger by promising him an amount of money that made his poverty-stricken brain tweak. Once at the warehouse for the stakeout, Dazai read a book, and Atsushi, who liked playing victim, started talking about his life story. He explained how the caretakers at his orphanage told him that he was a worthless twig who wouldn't achieve anything before tossing him like expired meat and asking him to unalive himself, which he had also failed to do. He then wandered around different cities starving until he got to Yokohama and saved the bandaged psycho. Once the moon came out, Dazai told Atsushi, who was freaking out, to relax and explained that his story of getting kicked out of the orphanage made no sense, as he alone was not able to affect the food ration of the institution. His travel timeline paired with the sightings of the tiger revealed that Atsushi was actually the tiger, and according to Dazai, the caretakers at the orphanage likely knew this and kicked him out without telling him why. After Atsushi, who had fully transformed into a magical Shere Khan, attacked Dazai, he used his ability, which immediately cancelled out any other powers with a single touch, to transform him back to his normal self. While Atsushi stayed on the ground passed out, Kunikida came to the warehouse with some others from the agency after Dazai's note had told them that the tiger would be found there. After he woke up, Dazai told Atsushi that he was the tiger because, for some reason, he apparently never had any recollection of his transformations, and as proof, one of the orphan's hands was still not fully reversed. So after a brief freakout, Dazai told him that he was going to join them at the agency. The next day, Atsushi, who finally slept in an actual house for the first time in months, woke up feeling grateful and got a call from Dazai, who told him that there was an important mission that needed to be handled immediately. After putting on the makeshift outfit they had left him at the dorm, he stepped out of his room and found Dazai stuck in an oil barrel in the middle of the compound. Apparently, he had tried to unalive himself again, but this time there was a lot more pain involved in the process, and he had wanted a smooth, painless transition to the spirit plane, so he required assistance. Since the rest of his co-workers simply congratulated him on his latest attempt, which seemed to be going well, he had no choice but to contact the newbie. With Dazai out of the barrel, Atsushi, who had spent time thinking since they deployed him into their supernatural ranks, decided that he was going to decline their offer. The agency was filled with powered individuals who had control over their powers and used them to help people, but he was different. He had powers that made him a Walmart-style beast boy, and it would have been a sweet ability if he could at least control it. But due to his chronic incompetence, he didn't even know he had the powers until the night before. So he decided that he was going to find a random job to do, and Dazai, who had a possible opportunity for him, offered to help him find one. On their way to the alleged job interview, Dazai was making sure that the recently homeless brokey could at least write when Kunikida showed up, and listed out all the agency's clients who had made complaints about how Dazai was an incompetent, problem-causing debtor before he told them that there was a bomber holding someone hostage in the office. After they got to the office and Kunikida's attempt at playing good cop ended in him being forced to get into the doggy position on the table, Dazai made Atsushi find a way to distract the bomber who was demanding to see the president. Atsushi, who was initially terrified to do anything, switched characters when he remembered that he was recently almost starving his way to heaven and started interrogating the bomber on his life choices. With Atsushi succeeding at his part of the mission, Kunikida used his Doppo poet ability to create a wire gun and snatch the bomb's remote before subduing the terrorist. When Dazai hit him with a sharp ego-bruising roast, he attacked the bandaged psycho, and the terrorist who got free snatched the remote back and activated the bomb. For some reason, Atsushi, who had just received a chance to live an okay life, decided to play pre-serum Steve Rogers and shielded everyone with his barely fed body. As it turned out, the whole thing was a test, and the bomber, who was named Junichiro, was a part of the agency. His sister Naomi, who was playing the innocent hostage, pounced on him with ecstasy as their little sibling bondage play had flipped her special buttons. The president, a man named Fukuzawa Yukichi, who could only afford to wear hand-me-down kimonos, approved of Dazai's latest recruit, and with that, they made the low-budget Beast Boy an official member of the agency. After his official addition to the team, they all went down to the cafe in the building where Junichiro was trying to apologize to him. But Naomi, who was still hyped up from their bandaged roleplay, wanted to finish off what they started. Kunikida tried to explain that they had a moral code at the agency, but with the Creepshow siblings demonstrating family love and Dazai
Wait a minute!
trying to get the waitress to choke him out, it became difficult to explain things. Atsushi was curious about what they all did before joining the agency since he was the only homeless brokey on the team. So they started with Kunikida, who used to be a math teacher and not the hot kind girls read about on Wattpad. The siblings were actually students, which made sense a bit but didn't explain their abnormal way of bonding as a family. Dazai, who was the only one whose former life was still a mystery to all of them, actually had a 700 grand reward for whoever could get it, and after mindlessly yapping for a couple of minutes, Atsushi failed to guess it, but was determined to find out the truth. They then got an update on a client looking to hire them, and went to meet her. While Kunikida took Dazai into the server room to discipline him for trying to get their client to perform a double isekai with him, the client explained that she worked for a company that was being plagued by smugglers who handled their business in the company building's alleyway. She wanted them to find evidence of smuggling, which she could then use to get help from the military. And since it was basically a stakeout mission, Kunikida, who was finished with Dazai, made the Creepshow siblings and Atsushi handle it. But before they left, he gave Atsushi the picture of a man named Akutagawa Ryunosuke, who was a user that worked under the feared port mafia that ruled Yokohama's underworld, and was actually somewhere in the city, turning cops into wall art before blowing up the station. After following Higuchi to her company's alleyway, she revealed that she was actually working for the port mafia before bathing Naomi in bullets and putting the barrel to Junichiro's head. Seeing his sister with more holes than usual got him pissed off, so he unleashed his light snow ability that recreated the Matrix and gave him the ability to create mirages to deceive his enemies. Before he could send Higuchi to hell, her boss, who conveniently turned out to be the Akutagawa that Kunikida was talking about, showed up and gave him a hole so he could match up with his sister. After their failed mission forced him to get angry enough to actually summon his ability, Atsushi went on the offensive against Akutagawa, but their powers were neutralized by Dazai, who had placed a tracker on Higuchi from the get-go and followed them. Akutagawa, who knew him, left after telling him that Atsushi had a 7 billion yen bounty on his head and promised to return with the full force of the mafia. After waking up later on in the agency infirmary, Kunikida told Atsushi that the siblings were okay and being attended to by Dr. Yosano, the agency's physician, who was more of a psychotic scientist than an actual doctor. Kunikida, who explained Atsushi's wanted status and the threat the port mafia posed, tried to play it cool, but after Atsushi called him out for holding his book upside down, his Batman act fell apart, and he left to protect the rest of his dignity. Somewhere in the city later that night, a boomer who clearly didn't like the idea of being a stay-at-home dad was escorted by a bunch of wannabe men in black to a hidden warehouse where some small-time thugs were selling port mafia cargo on the black market. After one of the thugs tried to question him, the nicotine-addicted boomer used his ability to turn the man's bones into mashed potatoes and went to finish his smoke, leaving the rest of his men to gun down the rest of the thugs. The next day, their escapades attracted attention from the whole city, including Atsushi and the guys from the agency who told him that the boomer and his men were from the Black Lizard, a deadly group that served as the port mafia's elite soldiers. Atsushi, who had lost his appetite after seeing the damage the Black Lizard had unleashed, decided to give Higuchi a call and told her that he would be quitting the agency and running away as his own way of saving them from having to suffer for him. After he took his things and left the agency building to resume his homelessness, Higuchi, who seemed to have heard his message in reverse, summoned the Black Lizard, who then assembled two more commanders that had a thing for each other and went to the agency's office, where they bathed the guys with their bullets. Atsushi, who hadn't gotten far, heard the shattering glass and started running back in confusion, as what he was trying to avoid was already happening. When he opened the door, expecting to find his friends filled with brand new body holes, he instead found the supposedly feared Black Lizard turned into human sandbags and piled up on the office floor. After they tossed the cold-blooded weakling outside the window, Kunikida started scolding Atsushi for vanishing when he needed help with cleanup, and Atsushi, who finally understood that his new friends were a bunch of overpowered psychopaths, started crying. While they all cleaned up the trashed office, Atsushi couldn't help but notice a certain co-worker named Rampo who was doing absolutely nothing, and told them that he was heading out for a detective mission after getting bored. According to Kunikida, Rampo was the city's greatest detective with an ability to immediately solve any case, and for some reason, he was a very special person. After being made to escort the wannabe Sherlock Holmes who couldn't use a train to his latest crime scene, Atsushi watched as he started arguing with Minura, the designated chief who was overseeing the case, as the victim who was found in the river happened to be his subordinate. While they discussed, the rest of the officers found something that looked like another victim in the water. But when they pulled it out, it turned out to be the psycho with an addiction to unaliving himself, who was back to his usual activity and got sad when he heard that a police force hottie crossed over to the other side without him. Rampo, who was still struggling to gain the chief's trust, decided to challenge the other subordinate named Sugimoto to solve the case of Miss Yamagiwa's murder in 60 seconds, and after Sugimoto failed to win the challenge, Rampo used his ability to immediately uncover the culprit, who was none other than Sugimoto himself. After the detective refused to show them his gun to cross-reference the bullets from the crime, he got pinned down by Atsushi before he could shoot the low-budget Sherlock Holmes. In the interrogation room later on, they found out that Sugimoto had entered the force with help from a politician who Yamagiwa had found some dirt on. He then called Yamagiwa to an abandoned shipyard to get her to turn over the evidence so she wouldn't get killed. But after she refused and struggled to collect his gun that he actually tried to use on himself, he accidentally shot her, and after calling the same politician for advice, he added 2 more holes to her chest to make it look like a signature Port Mafia hit. What gave him away was the fact that he wasn't bold enough to complete the signature hit by smashing her face. And during their discussion earlier, he somehow knew that the first bullet was what killed her. As they left after successfully completing the case, Dazai told Atsushi that Rampo didn't actually have any special deduction ability. This was why he was treated with respect at the agency, since he was solving complex cases with nothing but his brain. And to prove this, Dazai had actually used his ability-cancelling powers on Rampo during the investigation, which meant that the wannabe Sherlock Holmes was actually quite competent at his job and explained why he was unable to do anything else on his own. Kunikida Doppo, who went everywhere with his journal, was one of those self-improvement junkies that watched countless videos about affirmation journaling and decided to write out his entire life plan in his book. His life turned out to be as scripted as he planned, except for one deviant being his co-worker, Dazai, who had decided to use poisonous mushrooms to unalive himself but ended up high on junky shrooms and kept trying to strangle Atsushi. After ignoring the intoxicated psychopath until he was done with his morning routine, Kunikida finally knocked Dazai's brain in place before getting briefed on his case for the day. The trio then took a ride to the outskirts of town to double-check a tip on their case, which was about the recent kidnappings in the city. They first met with Taguchi Rokuzu, a fatherless hacker who actually received the tip-off on the location of the victims and assured them that it was legit. After leaving the fish lover's den, they called a cab driver who had started working for them after failing to achieve his Hollywood dreams and knew all of Yokohama's routes. He had also driven two of the victims and took the trio to the abandoned hospital the informant claimed was the location. Once inside, they found a lady who was trying to play Little Mermaid, and Kunikida saved her from her aquarium death. Sasaki Nobuko, who told them she was a university professor, explained that she had passed out at a train station and woke up in the tank so she didn't see the kidnapper's face, but she knew there were others in the building. The guys then broke down multiple doors until they found a bunch of victims in a separate compartment having a poison-infused sauna session. The next day, Kunikida's face was all over the news as a camera in the hospital had placed him on the scene moments before the victims succumbed to the gas. He then went to check on Sasaki and found out that she was with Dazai after staying at his place for the night. While Dazai teased him about a possible crush on the college professor, he seemed to have found out who the kidnapper was and summoned the cab driver. Once in the cab at a secluded location in town, Kunikida told them that the failed actor was the kidnapper. In a bid to make more money, he was gassing his clients and taking them to the abandoned hospital before selling them on the black market. When he found out that he had been caught, the driver asked for protection during the trial as he had apparently kidnapped someone from the Port Mafia group and was working for an organization that he sold the people to. As they spoke of the devil, the Mafia group showed up and rained bullets on the cab. While Dazai chased the driver and Atsushi called the cops, Kunikida had a brief match against Akutagawa, who left after the cops showed up. The location where the driver claimed his organization worked turned out to be the same building where a self-righteous terrorist named the Azure King ended himself. The terrorist had decided to go out in flames after Kunikida exposed his location, and a group of detectives were sent to bring him in as the local law enforcement agencies spent too much time rubbing egos. One of the detectives was the fatherless hacker's dad, which was why Kunikida paid special attention to him. Before they left, they saw a message from the anonymous informant named the Azure Messenger, who told them that a bomb was going to go off somewhere in the city. At the agency office, after reading the Azure Messenger's latest quest to the team, they realized that the informant wasn't actually trying to play undercover Batman. They were orchestrating terrorist-level attacks and forcing the agency to tackle them with a plan to make them look incompetent in the eyes of the public, which would then lead to a possible termination of the agency. With Kunikida's latest fumble already being a hot topic, they couldn't afford a round two, so they got to work on finding the bomb's location. With Rampo still being busy with a separate case, Kunikida turned to the fatherless hacker for help tracking the bomb's parts. At the cafe in the agency office's building, Dazai was on a date with Sasaki and took his time clowning Kunikida for being a diary ambassador. Kunikida, who was actually at the cafe with Atsushi, knocked out the bandaged creep and shunned him for indulging in such activities during an important investigation.
Good job!
Apparently, Sasaki was a social psychology professor, which was why Dazai was talking to her to get a professional perspective on things. For a college professor, she turned out to be very knowledgeable on the dead terrorists' escapades and attacks, which were mainly focused on criminals that escaped justice and politicians that abused their power. Basically, he was a solo Japanese Batman who didn't believe in second chances and was ready to soil his hands to effect change. She suspected that he was probably still alive and masquerading as the Azure Messenger, which could prove dangerous to Kunikida since he was the one that uncovered his location. But Kunikida was sure of the king's death, as forensic evidence was found on the bomb site, and after Sasaki told Kunikida that his perfect woman list was delusional, they got a call from Rampo and went to continue the mission. According to Rampo, the bomb was at a fish shop, which made sense since the Azure Messenger's plan was to detonate a blast that would affect hundreds of people, and the only way to do that was to get a bomb close to the petroleum complex. On their way to the bomb's location, they received a call telling them that the bomb's transmitter was at an abandoned police force base, and the driver of the taxi had died with a number on his palm. After getting to the abandoned base, Dazai and Atsushi went to find the transmitter, while Kunikida fought a user that had the ability to control anyone he gave a number until their number count got to 0, and they passed on like the failed actor. Seeing that he was no match for the number killer, Kunikida switched places with Dazai, who neutralized the number killer's ability, while Kunikida took down the bouncer that was pounding Dazai and Atsushi. He then used his ability to recreate the bomb's turn-off key, which the number killer had broken, and stopped the detonation. The next day, after running into Sasaki at the cemetery, Kunikida met with Dazai at an abandoned location where he claimed that he had summoned the mastermind behind the whole attack. When the fatherless hacker showed up, they thought it was him, but he had simply hacked into the message Dazai sent to Kunikida and wanted to see the Azure Messenger, who turned out to be Sasaki. She was the Azure King's lover and wanted to continue his mission to remove all the evildoers from the face of the earth. After she lowered her gun, which stopped Dazai from shooting her due to the law against excessive use of force, he dropped it for Taguchi, who immediately reunited her with her dead husband before reuniting with his dad after he saved Kunikida from Sasaki's bullets. While taking a stroll at night, a girl in a kimono found Dazai and used her flip phone to unleash an ability on him. The next day, Atsushi told the guys at the agency that Dazai was missing, but they simply didn't care, and told him that the bandaged psycho was more likely to be stuck after a failed attempt to unalive himself than lose to an actual threat or enemy attack. Junichiro, who was all better, volunteered to help him track down the suicidal maniac, but explained how important it was to avoid getting injured as Yosono, the psychotic doctor, was not someone he wanted to be stuck with. After Yosono came looking for an escort seconds later, Atsushi discovered that the office had become empty and ended up being the only one available to help her carry her shopping bags. On their way back after shopping, Atsushi walked past the girl that paid Dazai a surprise visit and bumped into a random stranger as he was distracted. Yosano, who tried to apologize to the man, ended up restructuring his fingers when he tried to get touchy with her. On the train ride home, he apologized for messing up the things she bought, but she was a bit more interested in his leg that had been chopped off during the Akutagawa attack, but had grown back without a single scar or sign of trauma. Just then, an announcer used the train speakers to give them a heads up as a bomb roasted some of the passengers seconds later. The announcer then asked Atsushi to surrender himself or be the reason the rest of the passengers ended up taking the train ride to heaven. Yosano, who didn't like when men tried to give orders, immediately went to find the bomber, who then gave her a welcome blast and introduced himself as Kaji Motojiro, a secret member of Port Mafia with a lemon bomb ability and an addiction to unaliving people. Atsushi was helping people on the train get to safe cars when he ran into the kimono girl, who was on a call with a certain someone that told her to use her demon snow ability to take out her enemies and protect the bomb. As she dropped the phone, a samurai lady's spirit rose up from her body and gave Atsushi some instant body modifications. Meanwhile, Yosano, who was back on her feet, tried to attack the lemon bomber and got tossed to the ground again. After he asked her what death meant and she failed to give him a good answer, he pinned her to the ground with a dagger and left some of his lemons to cook her up nicely, and Atsushi, who decided to use his powers after seeing the innocent people on the train and remembering his caretakers from the orphanage, managed to escape the samurai ghost's attacks and stopped Kyuka, the preteen assassin with a body count of 35. Kaji, who came back to see if Yosano was as crispy as he expected, found her catching some fresh air before getting his teeth reorganized by the psycho doctor, who explained that her ability made her fatal injuries heal before they could end her, and told him that he was going to receive a taste of her methods by getting his fair share of fatal wounds. After taking care of the bomber, Yosano told Atsushi that Kyuka was with the bomb's detonator, and after he turned it off, he found out that the bomb was already set off. Kyuka, who was actually being controlled, pushed him away before she jumped out of the train. Realizing that the orphan had been forced to become a weapon, Atsushi used his abilities to rip off the bomb mid-air and saved her from the blast. While he took a nap after they got to shore, Dazai, who was chained up somewhere, had a chat with his captor, Akutagawa. After she woke up at the agency's infirmary, Kunikida immediately started an interrogation, but Kyuka refused to say anything to them until they brought her some tofu. Atsushi, who was happy to treat a fellow powered orphan to some tofu, regretted his decision when she started draining his almost empty wallet. After having her tofu, she told them that she had been taken in by the port mafia and made to kill with her powers that could be controlled by the cell phone that Kunikida had disabled. She then told them that her superior was Akutagawa, and Kunikida pulled Atsushi aside to tell him that she was to be turned over to the military, who then would execute her for her crimes, before he left to inform the president. Dazai, who was getting settled into his new living conditions, was doing a vocal cord exercise when Akutagawa came in to give him a verbal and physical pounding. Akutagawa ended up being the one who got assaulted when Dazai, who used to work for the port mafia as Akutagawa's superior, told him that his ability was useless and his new subordinate, Atsushi, was way better than the cancer patient who dressed like Dracula. After they left the tofu spot, Atsushi, who didn't want to send the little death machine off to her execution, decided to take her sightseeing through the city. When he bought her some crepes with the last dime in his wallet, she took him to the military base where she planned to turn herself in, as she knew that a life eating tofu and sightseeing wasn't what she deserved. Before Atsushi could get a sentence in, he got speared in the chest by Akutagawa, who had put a tracker in Kyuka and took her back after dumping Beast Boy in a truck. At the agency, word of Atsushi's abduction had reached Kunikida, but efforts to track him down seemed futile, as the agency had an important escort mission to handle. However, thanks to Naomi, who went to call the big dog, all attention was immediately shifted to finding Atsushi. Dazai, who was still chained up, was visited by another old comrade named Nakahara Chuya, who used to be his partner, and knew that there was no way Dazai was easily abducted. After greeting his old friend by roasting his poor choice in fashion, Chuya broke his chains and asked for a fight. Meanwhile, back at the agency, they had finally found a lead, which was the company that owned the truck used to transport Atsushi, and after Junichiro made his way to the company to investigate their lead, he found out that the Port Mafia group had already tied up their loose ends to avoid getting caught. With no option left, the president promised to praise Rampo in exchange for finding Atsushi, and he immediately told them that the kidnapped orphan was on a ship that the Mafia was using to get past the agency's district. The president then gave Kunikida the keys to a boat belonging to the agency and told him to fetch their lost puppy. As Kunikida made his way to Atsushi, Dazai was getting pummeled by Chuya and couldn't do anything about it, as being able to predict his moves didn't make them any less painful or even avoidable. When Chuya asked him why he let himself get abducted with a knife to the throat, Dazai decided to drop the weakling act and told Chuya that he had sent a letter to the top executives telling them that if he died, their secrets would be revealed. Since he was a former top executioner when he worked for them, the secrets he knew were enough to make them come together for a meeting. And if Chuya killed him there, it would make him a traitor who would be hunted down and executed. Before Chuya left, he told Dazai that the records revealing the name of the person who placed the 7 billion bounty price on Atsushi were stored on the ship, and promised to send a beautiful lady who was interested in unaliving herself to help the bandaged psycho accomplish his mission next time. Atsushi, who had regained consciousness, saw Kyuka at the door and thought she was there to save him, but she was simply giving Akutagawa his overdramatic reintroduction to the wannabe Beast Boy. While Atsushi kept trying to figure out why Akutagawa hated him so much, Kyuka, who hadn't even had the chance to taste crepes before, decided that she wanted to save him and pulled a gun on her superior. But he sliced up her Glock and reminded her that there was nothing for her outside life as a weapon of the Mafia. After Kunikida finally got to the ship and called out to him, Kyuka let off a series of explosions she had prepared to sink the ship and told Atsushi to escape. He got to the edge and was about to jump, but then he remembered Kyuka, who was about to get put out of commission by her boss. Despite Kunikida's advice to let her go, he went back and saved her just as she was about to be finished off. After keeping her at a safe distance, he used his ability to attack Akutagawa, but with the cancer patient's space-consuming Rashomon, it was almost impossible to land a hit. Akutagawa, on the other hand, had no problem giving the low-budget Beast Boy a couple of holes that kept regenerating due to his ability, and started getting pissed off when Atsushi kept looking for smoke. When Atsushi managed to use the explosion to his advantage and got high enough to knock Akutagawa down to size, the cancer patient reached peak anger and started drilling him with countless attacks while remembering his time training under Dazai, who used to have a lot more bandages on his body and knew how to pull off a tux. The years spent honing his skills were what pissed him off about Atsushi, who just discovered his powers and was allegedly a better subordinate than him without even having much practice. After Atsushi took a look at Kyuka and remembered how Akutagawa considered her to be a worthless sack of organs who didn't deserve life if she wasn't being a weapon, he decided to stop playing nice and kept attacking through all of Akutagawa's hits until he broke through his space-consuming powers and sent him spinning into the ocean with a deadly overhead cross. Kyuka, who regained her consciousness, helped Atsushi, who had passed out from the fight, to get on the boat before Kunikida drove them away as the mafia ship capsized. Meanwhile, Dazai, who was still somewhere on the ship, had finally found the person paying $7 billion for Atsushi, and on a separate vessel, a man named Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was making his way to town. The next day at the agency, Atsushi was wondering how his co-workers would react to having an underage killing machine in the building. But when he opened the door, the entire agency was making her play dress-up, as she apparently made any outfit look good. While Rampo, who also liked the little assassin, fed her, the president walked in to assess the situation and see if having Kyuka stay with them was a viable option. Knowing that he would naturally refuse to house her, Atsushi begged on her behalf and offered to watch over her and take responsibility for whatever problems came with protecting her. Kunikida, on the other hand, was still against her joining them, as their life, which was filled with constant threats, was no place for a child. But after she used her childish cuteness to mess with the president's head, he decided to let her stay. At the Port Mafia's headquarters, Akutagawa was receiving treatment after breaking and burning everything except his face, while Higuchi got briefed on her boss's status as a useless pet after he failed to complete his mission. While she tried to wash away her pain in the sink, the Black Lizard commanders showed up, and one of them, named Gin, used his blade to show her that they were only obedient to her and Akutagawa because of his powers. With Akutagawa becoming a vegetable, she had nothing to keep them in line, and to make matters worse, after she got home that night, Akutagawa got kidnapped. Due to her undying loyalty to him, she ran to headquarters, grabbed every gun she could get a hold of, and left after telling the commanders that she would rather die than sit still and let them take her superior. After getting to the hideout where the smugglers that abducted Akutagawa were keeping him, Higuchi proceeded with her suicide mission and lasted less than a minute before her legs left the group chat. With one last attempt, she got knocked down and was about to head to the great beyond when the Black Lizard commanders showed up and saved her, before making their foot soldiers gun down their enemies. When she finally made it to her superior, for the first time ever, the arrogant Akutagawa apologized to her. The next day, Atsushi, who seemed to have forgotten his promise to watch over Kyuka, was being reminded by Kunikida when Chief Minura came in to ask Rampo for help with a new case, and left immediately after with his new subordinate. Kenji, one of Atsushi's co-workers, was giving them a crash course on his off-the-grid life in his village, where they used medieval methods to get rid of their criminals when they got word of a car that had randomly exploded in the city. Kenji went to investigate the case and took Atsushi with him, as he randomly asked locals about any information they had on the explosion. After a flashy gangster who seemed terrified of the Bible-style farm boy told them about some thugs that were buying nitrogen fertilizers, the duo went to find them. When they got to the hideout, Kenji calmly asked if they were the thugs with fertilizers that had something to do with the bombing, and after they denied any involvement, Kenji left with Atsushi, who couldn't believe the stupidity he was witnessing and told the farm boy that the goons were obviously lying to him. Kenji seemed confident in his tactics, and a couple of minutes later the goons surrounded them and claimed that they followed them after Kenji's obvious question meant that he already knew they were responsible for the bombing. Before Kenji could finish schooling Atsushi on his unbelievable detective techniques, one of the goons turned off his brain box with a bat and tried to attack Atsushi. When Kenji calmly got back up, they all froze and watched as the uninjured farm boy walked over to a car, picked it up, and turned the goons to roadkill before piling them up in the street. Atsushi, who was freaking out, called Kunikida, who then explained that Kenji's ability made him a low-budget Kryptonian that got extremely strong when he was hungry, but passed out immediately when he got some food. After waking up and finding Kyuka in his room, Atsushi went to get an explanation from Dazai, who told him that she had to stay with him for protection against enemy attacks, and explained that they were also not the most financially equipped agency, so rooms were not randomly prepared for orphans they found on missions. Dazai then told them about Francis Fitzgerald, the man who placed the 7 billion yen bounty on Atsushi's head and was the leader of a group of North American users known as the Guild. Coincidentally, Francis dropped in on a helicopter and came to see President Fukuzawa at that very moment. After making his introduction by listing out all his properties, he dumped a stuffed briefcase in front of the president and asked him to sell them the company's business permit. But after President Fukuzawa turned down the money as well as a bust-down Rolly, the guildmaster left with his escorts, and when they got off the elevator, Kenji, who had escorted them, vanished. The next day they found out that a random 7-story building had been removed and realized that it was the message Francis promised to send to sway Fukuzawa's mind. Kunikida then sent Atsushi to investigate with Junichiro and his sister, as none of them was to be left on their own. As they walked around the city, Naomi suddenly vanished, and as they were searching for her, some random stranger was also searching for his little girl. When Junichiro sensed a weird girl and caught up to her, they all got transported to a dimension she called Anne's Chamber, where their friends were being held beyond a magic door. Lucy Maud Montgomery was an apprentice for the North American Guild, and her ability created the alternate dimension where she built in 2 doors, one leading to captivity and the other to the real world that was frozen in time. To get to their friends, they had to play a game of tag with Anne, a botched version of the Squid Game robot that imprisoned those who failed to escape her. Atsushi, Junichiro, and the stranger, who were all looking for their friends and family, had no choice but to play the game of tag. Atsushi quickly realized how dangerous the game was when Junichiro got dragged away in an instant and managed to keep himself in the game with his ability. Lucy explained that she was also an orphan like him and was actually jealous of him because while he got picked up by his friends and co-workers that took care of him, she was given an ultimatum to succeed at her mission or get tossed away by the guild. When he eventually managed to get the key and win the game, she revealed that the key wasn't something that could be used. So he did the next best thing and made a run for it. But the stranger pulled him back and reminded him that his friends, who risked their lives for him, were counting on him. So he went on the offensive but failed as the pep talk wasn't enough to get the job done. The stranger was next, but when she got close to him, a deadly aura he was letting off paralyzed her legs, and he told her that she had already lost as Atsushi was still in the game, holding onto the door beams, and Junichiro was using his ability to create an illusion that made her think she had captured them. Atsushi then pulled her in with a ribbon he wrapped around her before he got pulled in and made her cancel her powers before getting locked in limbo with them forever. After getting back to real time, Lucy left to face her life as a homeless orphan. After Atsushi thanked the stranger for his help, he left with his precious Elise, who was actually also in the chamber, and Kyuka started vibrating in fear. The old stranger, who claimed to be an ex-doctor, turned out to be Mori Ugai, leader of the Port Mafia, who had instructed his boys to take out Francis Fitzgerald for trying to buy his way through town with an icebox watch.